When you think about the Royal Canadian Navy, you probably think of smaller ships, destroyers, frigates, and the like. You probably don't think about capital ships. This is reasonable. The Canadians would only operate 3 aircraft carriers over the course of the Cold War, though Canadian crews operated a couple escort carriers during the Second World War. And of those 3 carriers, only Bonaventure has really stuck in the popular imagination, largely due to her pilots, often called insane for operating aircraft that barely fit on the carrier. Regardless of that, though, it's left her predecessors pretty well forgotten. There was Warrior the First, and a well-traveled ship serving 3 different navies. And then there was the middle child and the topic of today's video, Magnificent. This ship would actually stay in Canadian service for a decent bit of time, from 1948 through 1957. Not as long as Bonnie, but not as short as Warrior. However, as noted, the ship is generally overlooked, with Bonaventure heavily overshadowing her, despite Magnificent being, in large part, responsible for building the Canadian carrier doctrine. Something we'll be looking at today, starting with the origins of this ship. Unsurprisingly, this story had its origin in the United Kingdom, more specifically at Harland and Wolff in Belfast, at the height of the Second World War, when the Royal Navy was working to build up its fleet, one aspect of which was the light fleet carrier, an idea unique to the Royal Navy of the time. You see, those ships were meant to be something of a middle ground between the relatively big armored carriers and the small escort carriers. It was recognized that the British simply lacked the shipyard capability to build large numbers of armored carriers. There would be no equivalent to the American Essex Swarm or even the Japanese Unryu. At the same time, however, there was a need for more aircraft carriers. Escorts were all well and good, be it for convoy escorts, transport, or supporting amphibious operations. But at the same time, they weren't built for fleet actions. And that is the role the light fleet carriers were supposed to be filling, as relatively small and cheap ships that could be built by civilian shipyards, like, for example, Harland and Wolff. Considering just how long some of those ships lasted, you can't say the idea didn't have merit. Even more so when you take into account these ships were not meant to last. In any case, though, Magnificent began her life as one of the Majestic class. These ships displaced 15,750 tons at the standard loading, and 19,500 when fully loaded. That tonnage came on a hull of 698 feet, 212.8 meters long, with a beam of 80 feet, 24.4 meters. This allowed Magnificent to carry, as designed, around 52 aircraft. Though, as planes grew larger and larger, that number would go down a bit. Either way, to protect those aircraft, the ship also had a decently large anti-aircraft battery for her size, 24 40mm pom-poms and 19 40mm Bofors, though there wasn't any armor to back those guns up as part of building the ships cheap. Another aspect of that relative cheapness would be the speed, or the lack thereof. Instead of the 30-plus knots of the big carriers, Magnificent was limited to 24 knots, on 40,000 shaft horsepower through 2 shafts. And with that covered, we've reached the end of the design and background. Now let's move to the service. As I said, this began at Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, with a new ship laid down on July 29, 1943. Construction would progress at a relatively fast pace, with the carrier launched on November 16, 1944, at which point things ground to a halt. Not through any fault of her builders, mind you. By November 1944, the war was clearly winding down. The British no longer had such a desperate need for new carriers. Certainly not emergency-built designs. This would impact all of the Majestics, as it turned out, and none of them would serve with the Royal Navy. Instead, construction slowed down as the war did the same. For Magnificent, this meant she was still in the fitting out stage when the Second World War concluded in late 1945, with a bit of a quirk to this status. The Canadians had, as I mentioned before, operated escort carriers. I've covered one in the form of the ill-fated naval. That meant the Royal Canadian Navy had a corps of trained and experienced sailors to operate carriers. But, well, no carriers of their own. The two escorts, Puncher and Nabob, were technically under Royal Navy control. So in light of this, the Canadians made an offer in late 1944 to exchange the escort carriers for two of the light fleet carriers on loan, something that the British approved in January 1945. At first, this consisted of the Colossus-class carrier HMS Warrior and the still incomplete Magnificent. Warrior has an interesting story all her own, but not, as it turns out, for her time in Canada, which was short-lived as she returned to Britain fairly early on, mostly because the ship had been completed and fit out for Pacific service, not the relatively cold Canadian waters. Magnificent, by contrast, was still incomplete and could be fit out to Canadian specifications, particularly for cold weather operation. This would delay her a bit, with the ship only completing in 1948, commissioning into the Royal Canadian Navy on March 21st of 1948, at which point the smaller and less suited Warrior was returned to the Royal Navy, mostly because the Canadians had reevaluated things and decided they could only operate one carrier. That carrier, at least for the moment, would be HMCS Magnificent, with the ship arriving in Halifax for the first time on June 1st, 1948. At the time, she was carrying 3 squadrons. The Canadian 803, equipped with Seafires. The 825th, as well, equipped with Fireflies. And finally, the Royal Navy's 806, equipped with the new Sea Vampire, Sea Hornet, and Sea Fury. This group went along with air shows, not as part of Magnificent's air wing. In any case, once in Canada, Magnificent started into intensive training duty, something that would run through the rest of the year with only 2 aircraft lost in crashes. Something impressive considering more experienced crews could and would suffer more losses just in normal operation. After this concluded, Magnificent sailed back to Britain in February 1949 to exchange her Fireflies for newer models of the same aircraft. After this, she sailed to the West Indies for further training duty through March, including one exercise where her planes located HMS Jamaica and launched a mock attack. This was successful and a good demonstration of her pilot's skill. On the other hand, what wasn't a good demonstration was her helm. Magnificent ran aground off Port Mouton in June 1949. Fortunately, the ship was pulled off with the help of some destroyers. It was still rather embarrassing to say the least. What was also embarrassing was a simmering discontent in the crew. This had been reflected in petty vandalism and the like over 1948. In 1949, however, things came to a head, specifically in March during training. 32 of the aircraft handlers locked themselves up and refused to do their work. They would present the captain with a list of complaints, from defective showers to overcrowding and bedbugs, among many other issues. Fortunately, the captain, G.R. Miles, showed understanding and managed to defuse the situation, which was carefully called an incident instead of a mutiny. To quote Canada's Navy, the unhappy men made it clear that a welfare committee to hear their complaints would have definitely helped, except Magnificent's executive officer flat refused to form one, leading to the issue. Either way, this would be resolved, and Magnificent continued along her work into the 1950s, though she would miss a chance on combat as that decade began. The Korean War broke out in 1950, and many ships, carriers included, were sent that way, famously including HMS Unicorn. That surge of ships is why Magnificent would not be among them. She wasn't seen as necessary to send over, so Magnificent remained on training and patrol duty instead. Important work, to be sure, in the event the Korean War led to a larger conflict. That it wouldn't hardly reflects poorly on Magnificent. We should, of course, all be thankful it remained confined to Korea. In any case, Magnificent's training continued, including a mock duel against her sister, HMAS Sydney. Magnificent would launch aircraft to search out and attack Sydney, while the Aussies did the same in reverse. It was an interesting case of sister ships training against one another in two different fleets. After this, Magnificent spent some time in European waters for an exercise, Maple Flag, alongside members of the British Home Fleet, notably including Vanguard, if you like more famous warships. Once this was done, Magnificent returned home. She would be attacked by Avengers on training duty before docking at St. John. This would mark a return to more typical training work, with Magnificent occupying herself in the West Indies. Nothing particularly noteworthy would happen during this, aside from a change in designation to the ship's squadrons. Her groups became the 30th and 31st Carrier Air Groups, while the squadrons became the 871st, 881st, 870th, and 880th. This was done to avoid confusion with the Royal Navy, which wanted to use the previous squadron numbers. New numbers aside, she spent the next year, 1951, on yet more training. Various operations, from normal training to large multinational exercises, with a couple transport runs working their way in there as well, including carrying both Royal Canadian Air Force Sabres and Canadian Navy Sea Furies, with all of this concluding in a lengthy refit starting in December 1951, something that ran through March 1952. Near as I can tell, this was a more standard overhaul than any sort of major modernization, something that will, in a little bit, become very important. For the moment, it was back to training. For the most part. There was actually a bit of a detour in the Mediterranean, as it would turn out. This involved a visit alongside HMS Glory to Istanbul on July 25, 1952. A visit cut rather short by the abdication of the Egyptian king shortly after arrival. Magnificent and Glory sailed at short notice just to keep an eye on things. When there was no need for action, the ships returned to training, ultimately going to the Atlantic in September for exercise or operation depending main brace. A massive NATO exercise that I've touched on a few times now. Among other things, it included over 160 warships. Regardless, that rounds off 1952, though things wouldn't really change all that much for the rest of the 1950s, if I'm being honest. More exercises and training duty, with the odd break in the pattern. As one example, the Coronation Review of Queen Elizabeth on June 15, 1953. 16 of Maggie's aircraft took part in the flyby, specifically 8 Sea Furies and 8 Avengers. After this came another large exercise, one even larger than main brace, in the form of Exercise Mariner on September 16, 1953. This one, quoting Hobbes, involved over 300 warships, 1,000 aircraft, and 500,000 men from 9 NATO countries. Quite a large investment, to say the least. Magnificent would sail with HMS Eagle and Vanguard, flying around-the-clock sorties, demonstrating that, despite its small size, the Canadian Fleet Air Arm was quite capable. Though this would be the last notable event before another major overhaul. Or rather, an overhaul in 2 stages. The first stage came in March 1954. There would be some short training on the Canadian West Coast before Magnificent was back in dock in December of that year. As 1954 gave way to 1955, not much would change again. Magnificent continued training with both the Canadian and the American navies, along with some visits to European ports before rounding off the year once more in dock. Not much of note happened really, and the same could be said for most of 1956, with 3 notable exceptions. The first came in February when Magnificent conducted her first helicopter operation, an important step forward, though one this ship wouldn't get to enjoy for long. In any case, the next event came on October 10th, 1956, in the final fixed-wing aircraft taking off from Magnificent, a Grumman Avenger, which marked the end of HMCS Magnificent's traditional carrier duty, though she wasn't quite out of service yet. First, Magnificent was put to use carrying supplies for her successor, HMCS Bonaventure. After this, she was assigned on November 6, 1956, to the Suez crisis. The Canadian government had agreed to send ground forces to Egypt. Magnificent would be used as a transport, though her weaponry was stripped for the role, only departing Canada on December 29, 1956. Her own crew reduced to 600 men, likely due to the lack of an air group and supporting sailors. Instead, she carried 406 Army personnel, 100 tons of supplies, 233 vehicles, and 4 Air Force DHC-3 Otters, along with a single HO-4S helicopter. Magnificent would arrive in Egypt on January 9th, 1957. She put her supplies ashore before returning home in March, where the ship would be cleared of supplies and decommissioned. The carrier was in excellent physical shape, having been well cared for. But the same issue remained. The Canadians only wanted one carrier, and this would be Bonaventure. Magnificent was functionally unmodernized with a straight deck. She would be sent back to Britain for the Royal Navy to deal with. Maggie's ultimate fate isn't exactly a surprise. The Royal Navy had no use for her, nor the funding for an expensive refit and modernization. So Magnificent was put in reserve and ultimately on the disposal list in 1961, though she wouldn't actually be scrapped until 1965. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.